Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Millennium Fellowship Global Webinar. My name is Liliana Alonso. I'm a campus director from CETIS Universidad in Tijuana, Mexico. Woo! And I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. Before we begin, please let us know in the chat where you're joining from and which SDG your project focuses on. Okay, I can see someone from India. Alvin Sebastian, hi. Your SDG is the number 5, gender equality. Nice. That's mine too. Okay, someone from New York. Okay, someone from Kenya, SDG 9. Okay, someone from Bangladesh, hello. India, SDG 4. Colombia, hola. Chile, SDG 16. Hola a los chilenos. Okay. From China. Okay, Boyun from China. Okay. From Uganda, SDG 4, equality education. No, quality education. Okay. Pakistan, SDG 13, climate action. Nice. I see a lot of people here. I like that. Okay, so thank you everyone for sharing. It's amazing to see how global and diverse our community is. So today we're honored to have Matthew Hunter, Partnerships Lead at the United Nations Youth Office, who will be sharing insights of intergenerational leadership, innovation, and sustainability. The session will include a keynote by Matthew, followed by a question and answers where you'll have the opportunity to ask your own questions. Let me briefly introduce Matthew before giving him the floor. Matthew currently serves as a partnership lead at the UN Youth Office and has previously led partnerships and strategic communications in the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, as well as communications at the UN Global Compact. Through his work, he's been exploring how intergenerational leadership can unlock innovation and sustainability, especially when young people are genuinely included in decision making. Above all, he's committed to ensuring that young people have both a seat and a voice in global processes. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Liliana. And yes, it's so great to see so many of you joining from all over the world. I hope everyone's having a good morning, afternoon, evening, especially on a Friday for those of you that are joining late. But it's also just really such a pleasure on my end to be here, and just maybe to start by saying a big thank you to the Millennium Campus Network and also UN Academic Impact, both for launching the Millennium Fellowship, but also for facilitating spaces like this, which I think are so important. And it's really encouraging from our side at the UN Youth Office to see so much interest and to see so many young people like all of you who are not only committing your time to these projects and to the fellowship work, but also to engaging in spaces like this. So hopefully I'll try to be relatively brief because would much rather also have space and for questions, discussion, and also to hear from all of you. But maybe just to share a couple of thoughts and reflections, both from my own sort of experience having worked in the UN, but also specifically from the youth office side, and maybe to give a little bit of context on some of the work we do, which hopefully might be of interest and relevance to many of you. So maybe I'll start by saying I think I've had a very non-traditional background or path, I guess, when it comes to working in the UN. I've been in the UN for about the past decade, as you heard a little bit there through the introduction. But before that, I actually was back in Canada, where I'm from originally. I was doing research with a university there, looking at this intersection between public, private, and nonprofit partnerships in urban development. And I was really interested at the time in how I could take that interest and turn it into something that was more connected to my career and what I was going to do longer term. And I very much wish that I had had the opportunity to engage with something like the Millennium Fellowship back when I was starting out my journey in my professional career, because I think so often it's difficult to know, as I'm sure many of you have experienced too, where the different entry points or pathways can be to take this passion or the work that you've been doing and connect it into these global spheres or global processes. And so for me, this really came when I first had this opportunity to begin working with the Global Compact. And for those of you that might not be aware, I wasn't aware before I started working there. It's a UN entity that focuses specifically on private sector engagement. So they look specifically at trying to connect companies more closely with the UN so that they're aligning their strategies and operations with the Sustainable Development Goals and with other agendas that the UN is working on. And I think for me, this was really uh, such a powerful reminder of how big the UN system is and how much influence and impact they're having across different spheres that we don't always even know or think about on a day-to-day basis. And so I worked for about 5 years with the Global Compact, working on a range of different things from executive communications, partnership building, campaigns, flagship events. And I think it was great because it really gave me this sort of breadth of experience in terms of engaging with different parts of the UN system, and very much reinforcing what I was just saying, that there's so many different ways that the UN is connecting to many of our daily lives, and we don't even always realize it. And I think many of us have very specific things we think about, but it doesn't always capture the breadth of what the UN is really doing. So really grateful for that sort of entry point into the system. And then from there, I was fortunate enough to go and join the former Youth Envoys team. Some of you may know her, Jay Athma. I know she also engaged over time also with the Millennium Campus Network in different capacities. I led the Partnerships and Strategic Communications team under her office for about 4.5 years. Um, Looking at all sorts of different ways that we could better connect young people around the world to the UN. I think it was a really nice synergy, actually, building on the former work I had been doing in the system, trying to think about different innovative ways that we could connect non-traditional audiences to the work that the UN was doing and to bring the UN closer to people in their everyday lives. So as I said, I worked for her team for about 4.5 years, and then in 2023 was part of the team that sort of oversaw this transition from the Youth Envoy's office into the newly established UN Youth Office. And so maybe I'll just use this as a segue to give a little bit of a background on the office, depending on how familiar some of you might be or not. But this is actually one of the newest offices ever created within the UN system. We've only been in existence for less than 2 years. But it definitely isn't the first time the UN has ever worked on youth, of course. So the UN has worked on youth for many years, both under the envoys, but also through things like academic impact that I mentioned and a variety of other programs that have been really effective at building this foundation for how the UN can engage with young people. But the UN Youth Office is really the first time that there's ever been a standalone office dedicated to working on youth within the system. And I think this is such a powerful reflection, both of the work within the system to build this agenda, but also of young people. And so many young people around the world who have been advocating for this for many, many years. I'm sure potentially also some of you here. And a reflection from the UN and from the governments of the world that this is an important agenda that the system needs to continue to prioritize. Um, so just to talk a little bit about what we do. So we're a very small office, actually. We're based fully here in New York at the UN headquarters. It's only about 15 to 20 of us, give or take, within the team. But our job is really to try to coordinate the entire UN system's work with and for youth around the world. So we don't have country offices around the world or engage in programming on the ground, but instead we're really more of a political and advocacy office that's really working to try to elevate and push the youth agenda forward at a global level and to make sure that a youth perspective or a youth inclusive lens is added to everything that the UN is doing. Um, so as part of this work, we have part of our office that works specifically with all 132 UN country teams around the world, all of the regional commissions, the 60 plus UN entities. So many of the entities that all of you will know and recognize, like UNICEF, UN Women, UNDP, UNFPA, and others. So we work with all of those offices to try to streamline the ways that they're working with and for youth around the world. And so it's our job to try to make sure that they're being stronger, but also more meaningful in the ways that young people are being engaged, and trying to elevate the agenda across the board. And they do this by reporting back to us on a series of metrics and key performance indicators under the UN system-wide youth strategy, which is called Youth 2030. But on the other side of it, a huge part of our work is really about trying to connect the UN, as I was saying, better to external constituencies. And that's very much work like this and like all of you and the work that you're doing through the Millennium Campus Fellowship, but also through so many other important initiatives that exist around the world. So what we're really trying to look at is we know so often that we hear from young people or other partners that the UN is something that people think is important. We know generally more than any other demographic, young people tend to be the group that have the most faith in institutions like the UN still, but it can also sometimes still seem very far off or very distant from a young person's daily life. It's very bureaucratic. It's a very complex system to navigate. Even as someone that's been in the system for 10 years now, I still constantly learn new things or find new things out that I didn't previously know. And so we really see part of our role as being trying to bring the UN closer to young people and young people closer to the UN, and to really bridge this gap to help young people better understand that the UN is an institution that cares about the same types of things that young people care about. And it's a platform that is really important when we speak about ensuring young people's voices and perspectives are heard on so many of the challenges that are facing our world today. I probably don't need to tell many of you this, but there's 2.4 billion young people in the world currently between the ages of 15 to 34 years old, which is the primary sort of age range that our office works with. But even more than that, 50% of the world's population is under the age of 30. So it's really critical, of course, that if we're talking about tackling some of the biggest challenges facing the world today, we know young people need to be front and center of shaping solutions to those challenges. And so this is really, I would say, at the heart of what our office does. It's trying to make sure that there's more spaces for meaningful engagement for young people, that young people better understand how the UN is a platform that they can engage and participate in, and a space where their voices can be heard, moving away from tokenism to true, meaningful engagement where young people are more systematically included across all of the UN's work. Um, so maybe I'll pause there just to make sure that we leave lots of time also for open discussion. I'm sure I'll have an opportunity to elaborate on many of those things more, but hopefully that gives a little bit of an overview of the work our office is doing. And yeah, very much keen to also explore how we can continue strengthening the ways we engage with so many of you and the important projects you're also leading around the world.
Thank you so much for those insights, Matthew. We'll now begin with some questions. So remember that we're going to have a Q&A, so start thinking about your question. So first, you co-author a report in collaboration with the SD Gallen Symposium and the Club of Rome titled How Intergenerational Leadership Unlocks Innovation and Sustainability in Business. From your perspective, what are the best ways for young leaders to be part of decision-making processes within the broader UN system?
Yes, thank you so much. And I think this very much speaks to what I was just mentioning at the end of my sort of introduction as well. Um, we know that there are so many different ways for young people to engage, and there are so many pathways, but it's not always clear what those pathways are or what the entry points are. And so for us, we're really trying to help young people to better navigate that. And we actually launched our office an initiative earlier this year called the UN Youth Compass, which was very much inspired by a lot of the narrative in that report you were just speaking about, but also lots of work that we've been doing in recent years. And this whole idea of the UN Youth Compass is to help young people better understand the ways that they can meaningfully engage in policy and decision making, with this particular emphasis on trying to shift this idea of power from needing to be in a room in New York at UN headquarters to also understand that participation can look like many, many different things at many different levels. There are so many ways that young people can meaningfully engage in UN processes, whether that's organizing local consultations, participating in engagements that are organized at country level, regional level, global level, feeding into intergovernmental negotiations or outcome documents. And this exists also across so many topics that the UN works on. There's the climate process, the gender process, the processes on anything you could imagine. And so for us, this idea of the compass is to try to help make those pathways more clear, and so that young people can then understand ways that they can both self-mobilize, but also take the expertise that they already have and bring it to those spaces where it's so urgently needed.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. I really agree with that. And also, inclusion, I think it's really important. Must it can be more than symbolic. So it has to come with trust and shared responsibility. So the second question is Millennium Fellows around the world are advancing projects aligned with the SDGs. And sometimes achieving those goals feels almost impossible. What advice will you share with them on measuring their impact in relation to the SDGs, even when progress seems out of the reach?
Yes, thank you so much. And actually, maybe before I respond to this question, just to pick up, because I think this point you raised on inclusion is so important. And I wanted to just underline as well that I think for us, when it comes to participation, one of the really important points too, and I think this network, amongst so many others, is a really powerful example of this. I think the UN has gotten very effective in recent years at engaging a small group of young people, those who understand how to navigate these spaces, young people who have better understood the terminology, the acronyms, the jargon, and the ways to engage in different intergovernmental processes. And for us, I think one of the most important opportunities is how we democratize access and increase inclusivity so that any young person who's passionate about these topics understands ways that they can also engage. We need to find ways to bring more young people in with that exact spirit in mind. And so I think very much keen to help try to make that happen and to hear more voices from all of you and so many others also as part of these spaces. Um, but in terms of the question you just raised also in the projects related to the SDGs and how it can sometimes seem disconnected, or how we bridge this gap between what young people are so often doing at local or community levels with global platforms or spaces, I think so much of this is also about realizing that what we are currently doing as a global community isn't working well enough. So we need new people and more people with more enthusiasm, more energy, and more ideas if we're really going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And because of that, that's why I think movements like the Millennium Fellowship, it's so inspiring to see an entire generation of young people that are passionate about putting their energy, ideas, creativity, and solutions towards challenges like this, which are some of the biggest challenges that our world is facing today. And I think the point I would emphasize here too is really focus on doing your part in your sphere of influence, um, and then figuring out ways to bring that influence to different UN fora and different UN spaces. If you're working on something at a community level that's having clear impact in your community, that's contributing to the SDGs. And what we need is more stories like that brought to UN spaces so that we can understand how these can be scaled up and brought into broader platforms. Um, so just to, I guess, encourage you all to see the direct impact that you're having day to day and to think about ways to bring that experience to these platforms, because I think there's so much that those who engage in negotiations, et cetera, at the UN can learn from the experiences you're having through things like this fellowship.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. So thank you for that perspective. The next question says, as partnerships lead, you collaborated with people from numerous countries. What strategies have you seen work best to strengthen intercultural dialogue and collaboration? And how can we make sure the partnerships we will truly reflect the diversity of the world we live in?
Yes, thank you so much. And I think this is such an important question. Also, in light of, or especially in light of everything we see happening around the world today, right? I think something that's really important to remember, I think from my point of view, is the UN is still the only platform in the world that brings together every country for multilateral discussion and diplomacy and dialogue. And we know it's not a perfect system, and there's lots that needs to hopefully change and evolve. And I think this is where our office would firmly believe young people need to be a key part of this, and why we're really advocating to keep this momentum behind the youth agenda so that we see this new vision of multilateralism that includes young people front and center. Um, but in light of this, I think it's also why it's so important that when we speak about youth engagement, that it is intercultural, intergenerational, and diverse in all of its facets. When we're talking about bringing young people together. The beauty of the UN is that you have people in all of their diversity around the world coming together to solve challenges to the greatest issues facing our planet and our world today. And we very much need that same thing reflected when it comes to young people. And I think this goes to what I was just speaking about before. It's great that we see more and more youth representation in spaces at the UN, etc. But we also need to think about who's not in those rooms currently and constantly be thinking about how we can ensure that young people in all of their diversity also have access and the opportunity to participate. And that looks like there's so many different barriers that prevent young people in so many different contexts around the world from meaningfully or equally engaging. So constantly thinking about how we break down those barriers and try to also meet young people where they are. I think that's an important point. Not always expecting young people to come to the UN and to adapt themselves or to meet the UN, but to think about how we can take these platforms and spaces to the communities, to the spaces where young people already are, and to make it and to facilitate that connection in a more meaningful way.
Absolutely. And I love that. I really love how you answer this. And also, I think about listening and having respect about all of this diversity builds that partnership. So thank you. And before the next question, just a reminder to the fellows that ask your questions in the chat. We're going to have a Q&A section. So put your question here. So the next one is, we're all young change makers, passionate about creating impact in our communities. As someone with experience in communications, what advice will you give us on sharing our impact stories in ways that inspire collaborations and attract new partnerships?
I think that this is such an important question as well. And I'm sure something not only all of you, but I think everyone who works in this space is constantly thinking about when it comes to the ways that they can bring their work and their impact to global platforms. I think the number one recommendation or suggestion I would give, having worked in this space for a few years now, in different capacities, especially as young people, to be authentic to yourselves and to show up as you are. I think something, especially when it comes to storytelling and to sharing your experience, your impact, your vision, your innovative ideas, etc. I think so often this idea of not just the UN, I think this is true in many spheres, but the UN, I think, is one example. People it's intimidating. I think people sometimes show up to a space and think that they need to dress a certain way or speak a certain way or act a certain way, or they need to change the way they communicate to match the platform. And I actually think it's the exact opposite when it's most effective. I would really encourage, and we say this all the time to young people who come to events that our office supports or when we're engaging with young people before major events. It's to show up as you are, to speak as you want to speak, to share your vision as you want to share your vision, to communicate the story the exact way you would communicate it to other people in your communities. I think the most effective young storytellers and all storytellers really in these spaces are those that are sharing in a more authentic way and aren't feeling the need to change the way they communicate just for the platform. Of course, there is something about knowing your audience and knowing who you're trying to persuade and how you're trying to tailor your message. I think that's always true. But I think the big risk we have as a global community is that the way we're currently doing things isn't working clearly. We're far off track to achieving the SDGs by 2030. There's so many challenges, in some ways unprecedented challenges facing the world today. We need to think about new ways of doing things. And one of the biggest risks we have in that respect is in training or encouraging an entire generation of young people to change the way that they communicate, the way they present, the way they show up to match the way we were doing things just because it's the way it's always been done. And so for us, I think really encouraging you all as you continue on your social impact journeys and whether that's engaging at the UN or in so many other spaces, um, to bring a new vision to how you want to also see things done, and to be confident and authentic in that. And truly, I can say I think that the most powerful interventions or moments I can think of in the context of the UN, where young people have been most effective in delivering that, have been ones that are authentic in nature, not where someone showed up and gave a specific speech or something else. So that would be one piece of, yeah, a suggestion.
Thank you, Matthew. That's a great reminder to that storytelling is also about connection and have this authenticity about us. So thank you so much for your answer. Now we'll open the floor for questions from our Millennium Fellows. So please type your questions in the chat box. I will reading some of you. So starting with, okay, this is from someone from Pakistan. It says, my question is that how UN is managing to adjust the youth from global south in its system, like the special programs and something like this.
So if I understood correctly, just to make sure I'm understanding the question, I think around ensuring that young people, especially youth from the global south, are represented and have opportunities to engage in all sorts of different programs. Um, so I think there's multiple answers to this, I guess. So one would be that the UN has a massive presence around the world, right? So there's 132 countries around the world have UN country offices or country teams based in those countries, where the UN is doing work on the ground. So I guess to say to start, that I think is a great resource for work you're doing in your country, to be in touch with the country team that works in that country that's working specifically with young people from Pakistan, from Rwanda, from Uruguay, from anywhere in the world where there is a UN country team, um, working with young people on the ground. And that's part of our work too, right? Is to make sure that those teams are being strong and inclusive in the ways that they're engaging with young people in their national context. Um, so I would say that's the more day-to-day answer. But then I think there's also an important component about this, about global spaces, global processes, etc., which is very much work that our office does, right? So when there's a major global event or convening, for those of you that might be aware, the UN General Assembly week just happened about a month ago, here in New York, which is the week, it gets a lot of news coverage around the world, but it's basically the week where heads of state and government from around the world come to New York, meet at the UN, and sort of discuss or have meetings on some of the most pressing high-level topics. And we worked to facilitate different spaces for youth engagement across that week. Um, Trying to bring in different youth voices, having young people engage in like a whole variety of different spaces, and also trying to convene spaces that were maybe a little bit more non-traditional, right? So like not the typical a young person sitting at a podium speaking, but trying to like also get world leaders sitting in rooms with young people having more unfiltered or unstructured conversations. And I think how that connects to what you're asking is, I mean, for us, very much at the heart of our work is trying to make sure this like principle of leave no one behind, trying to make sure that young people in all of their diversity are represented in these different platforms and spaces. And so, I mean, that looks both from a geographic perspective in terms of ensuring that young people from across the global south in different spheres have opportunities to engage, but also looking at different intersectional lenses, whether that's young women and girls, indigenous youth, youth with disabilities, all a whole range of different young people who maybe are underrepresented in these spaces traditionally because they face a range of barriers that make it more difficult. So definitely not perfect. And I think this is an area we're always seeking to improve, but I would say it's very much a core mantra in how we're trying to have a constant lens of ensuring that opportunities that go to young people on these platforms have this vision of leave no one behind built in.
Okay, thank you for your answer. The next question from the Millennium Fellows is, how does the UN Youth Office ensure that the voices of young people are heard in UN and outside of it?
So that's a good question. So I mean, within the UN, I think this very much goes to everything I was speaking about before with the UN Youth Compass and a lot of the work we're doing within the system. So for us, it's really about making sure that every intergovernmental process that happens within the UN needs to have youth perspectives meaningfully integrated at all stages. And that's definitely not happening perfectly yet. There's some processes where it's barely in existence at all, and then there's others where it's much, much stronger. But for us, it's about, I think, trying to constantly move that bar towards mainstreaming it so that we eventually see it happening across all processes. And this is really our role as like a steward within the UN system, right? So we don't lead each individual process because we're a very small team, but we work with all of the UN entities that run these processes to try to push, encourage, guide those entities to be stronger. Um, and then on the point around outside of the UN, I think this is such an important point as well. And I think this really goes to the core of a lot of my work in the office too, right? It's about thinking, how can we, as a convener, bring together the right different types of stakeholders to move this agenda globally? And so we work a lot or increasingly with private sector, with foundations, with civil society, with academia, trying to create rooms that bring together leaders from across these different sectors, so that it's not just about championing youth participation and youth leadership in the UN, but really trying to drive a global cultural transformation to see young people as partners, leaders, equal contributors on the agenda rather than like beneficiaries or those that are like more junior or like intro in their career. And so I think it's a combination of both, right? Like there's the process, there's the tangible progress within the UN, but then there's also how we work with the right partners or stakeholders outside of the UN to really make this more of like a cultural shift to help people think about youth participation and youth leadership in a different way.
Thank you so much for your answer. This one says, hi, Matthew. Thank you so much for your insights. My name is Severin. I hope I said that well. And I just wanted to ask, we're really interested in getting more involved. What will be the best way to engage with your office work?
Yes, perfect. So I mean, I can maybe drop in the chat before the end, or I can also share with the MCN team and make sure it gets disseminated to everyone. But two sort of immediate suggestions I would make. So if you're not already, I would definitely encourage everyone to follow our office across different social media platforms. We're at UN Youth Affairs on every channel that you can probably think of. Um, and also, in addition, we run something called the Youth 2030 Pulse, which is a monthly newsletter. And on both of these channels, really what they're trying to do is to compile youth-related events, news, opportunities, etc., from across the entire UN system. So we're not sharing just work that comes from us specifically, but trying to compile anything that might be of relevance or interest to a young person and to share it on a more systematic basis um, moving forward. On the participation front specifically, so those channels also cover things like fellowships, new reports, events, all sorts of different engagements. On the participation side specifically, we have this new youth compass, which has now been launched. And the idea is we're sort of building as we go. There will be a set of resources that'll be available there within the next couple of months that'll more concretely help young people to engage also on that front. But we'll also be planning to share opportunities under this banner of the compass as part of the Youth 2030 Pulse and also across our social channels. So would really just encourage everyone, if these are things that are of interest to you, to also um, tune into some of those different platforms that I think we try to use as ways to reach young people in terms of sharing opportunities.
Thank you. Just a reminder from the Millennium Fellows, you can ask your questions in the chat or you can raise your hand and you can ask them live, okay? So we're here to reading your questions and here's Matthew to answer that. Okay, this one says, how does the UN Youth Office plan to expand its engagement with young leaders at the grassroots level?
A very good question as well. So one thing that's really important for us, so the reason when our office was established, the reason we don't have country level offices around the world or regional offices, and we just have this small team based in New York, um, was very intentional, right? Because the last thing we want to do is duplicate something that's already happening, right? So the UN already has a massive presence around the world engaging with young people through all of the UN entities and country teams that I was speaking about previously. So the worst thing we could do would be to just create another structure, put more money towards another way to engage with young people. Instead, for us, I guess there's two channels here. So one is through the UN itself. And so this is about how we can better encourage and strengthen the ways that UN country teams are engaging with grassroots youth and with young people on the ground. And we have a series of like tools, resources, and other things that we help to try to provide to them as guidance. This is definitely not perfect, and I'm sure maybe some of you have experienced this in your own context. In some countries, the youth engagement through the UN country team might be very strong and very robust, and they're doing a lot of work with youth on the ground. In others, it might be almost non-existent or very, very minimal. And I think this is where our role comes into play. It's like how we continue to make sure that it's stronger and stronger. I think this goes to the challenge that like a lot of country teams, they're also working on everything the UN does in one context. So how do we ensure that youth is an intersectional priority for them in everything they're doing, right? It's not about like just youth specific programming. It's you're doing programming on climate. It's critical that you have a youth perspective as part of this. You're doing programming on gender. It's critical that there's a youth perspective as part of this. So I think we've definitely seen progress on this in recent years. There's still a long way to go. Um, but on the opposite side, so I think the UN is one channel. I think the one that's actually I'm maybe biased because it also connects more to my role, but I think the one that's also less that there's a bigger opportunity is also thinking about other networks like Millennium Campus Network and so many others that young people already engage in on a day-to-day basis on the ground. There are huge movements of young people, whether they're youth-led movements that are self-organized or through youth serving civil society organizations like World Scouting, World YMCA, World YWCA, so many others that engage with young people and in particular grassroots youth on the ground on a day-to-day basis. And so a lot of our work is also trying to build this stronger bridge between these massive networks and movements of young people to help those movements understand ways that they can plug into the UN. If we use Millennium Campus Network as an example, the team at MCN understands much better than we do how to reach you all through things like these webinars, through all of the different channels that you engage with. So how can we tap into partners like MCN and so many others to help reach young people where they're already driving impact and to bring them closer to the UN and vice versa? So again, not perfect, but I think this is something we're really interested in continuing to strengthen and to try to build out. And especially if any of you are part of other movements or networks that you think would benefit from being closer to the UN and hasn't engaged with our office before, I would definitely encourage you to reach out and would love to ensure that you're being connected to the right resources, opportunities, etc., to make that happen.
Thank you. I see Stacy raising her hand. So first, can you introduce yourself, Stacy, and then ask the question you have?
Hello everyone. I hope you guys can get me. Lillian, are you able to get me clearly?
Yes, can hear you perfectly.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Tessie Grace. Yeah, I'm from Kenya, and yeah, I'm also a Millennium fellow. Yeah, so I am championing for all the SDGs. Sorry to say that. Yeah, it might sound funny. Yeah, so I am training women and the youth on majorly sustainability. And I am also trying to create a sustainable green jobs, maybe for the women and the youth, while reducing pollution. So this project of mine, I am doing it across the shores of Lake Victoria, where the women and girls have to engage in, sorry to use this term, but the transactional sex for fish for survival. Yeah, I'm just requesting and maybe asking how can the UN come in and help change the lakeside community for number one, a greener transformation, number two, for decent work for these women and the young girls, and number three, health and well-being, maybe quality education. That is why I just started by saying I am championing for all the goals because uh, when I'm meeting all these women, we touch on all the corners of the SDGs. Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you so much. And maybe to start by just saying thank you also for the really important work and for I mean you hit on it, but it's so intersectional and connects to so many of the SDGs and the important work that's being done. So I think it's really important that there's young people that are prioritizing leading in that space. Um, I mean, my most, without having the full overview, of course, of the exact project, I mean, my first recommendation would definitely be to get in touch with different UN entities or the country team in Kenya that are working on the ground. I can imagine there are a number of synergies and interconnections between priorities that they have and the work that you're doing. Um, and so finding ways, whether that's through support and scaling the initiative or the project, connecting you with other networks or government officials or others locally who might be able to help back the project or help to take it to scale, would be very glad to help try to suggest like an entry point within the UN country team within Kenya as one initial point. Um, and I think that really is a good starting point in cases like that, where it's like the most concrete way to also scale the work on the ground.
Thank you. I see another hand. It's from Anania Powell. Can you introduce yourself too and ask your question, please?
Good evening. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. First of all, thank you so much, sir. It has been so insightful knowing about whatever you were talking so far. I am Ananya Paul. I'm from Christ University, India, and I'm really grateful to be a part and campus director of my campus. And my question is that I've seen in the chat as well, so I feel like I might be talking for a lot of people. So I have been working on SDG 5 gender equality, and my project name is Metamorphosis, where I try to focus on women especially, and talking about all kind of violence and microaggressions that exist in the society and how I can curb the same and work on the same. So my question is that, as you mentioned previously as well, that we can get in touch with the UN entities and synergies in our country and in our state to get ahead with our project and perhaps also work with UN one day. Could you please also elaborate the process a little more? Because I want to pursue a career in an international organization like United Nations, and I have previously also volunteered for child rights with UNICEF, and currently I'm also a psychology student. So how can I make a difference? How can I navigate my way in an international organization and become a part of it as an employee or as an intern in whichever way possible, and make a change in the society one day as well?
Yes. Um, Great. No, thank you so much for the question. And I guess there's two key points there that I was taking away from what you were asking as well. So I think the first one maybe very concretely on how you can get in touch, like as I've been saying, like to get in touch more locally. I mean, I can share, as I was mentioning, I'll share other links in the chat after, but I'll drop it even in right now so that everyone has it. There is a public overview that exists of the key focal points and contact emails of all UN country teams around the world, which I would suggest is the best starting point in terms of trying to get in touch. Of course, not in all cases will this necessarily work because again, they're dealing with many different things. So if you're not getting a response or engagement through this channel, I would definitely encourage you to also get in touch with our office and we could help to identify more specific contact points or focal points, et cetera, to follow up if needed. But I think that's a great global overview that exists for everyone. And I would definitely encourage everyone on this call, but also the broader fellowship network and others to see that as a resource that exists. So that's in terms of like the day-to-day work and connecting with the UN on the ground. On the second question around like career pathways or engagement opportunities with the UN, etc. I won't I could give a whole spiel on this topic in particular. There's an entire division within the Office of Human Resources within the UN, which has like a lot of great resources for young professionals who are looking to potentially enter in careers in the UN. But I think the overarching suggestion I would make for everyone would be engagement with the UN can look like many different things, right? Also in a social impact career, or if that's where you're looking to really work professionally after these projects and after your studies. And so one of it would be looking for opportunities to work in the UN when there's open positions or in countries or in areas that you have expertise in. But I think the other is to also think about the huge networks of partners that the UN works closely with on the ground around the world every day, also to implement its work. I think what's so great about the UN is that it's a massive global ecosystem of so many different partners that are working together towards common goals and towards the SDGs. And so also thinking about different entry points where you as a professional, young professional might be able to engage. And that doesn't always have to look necessarily like a job in a UN country team or in a global UN headquarters. I think in some ways, there's actually sometimes even more exciting opportunities. The UN is great as a platform and would definitely encourage people to also see it as one space to engage. But in some ways, I mean, the UN also has its own limitations too, right? It's a multilateral platform that brings together governments. In some cases, I think there's even maybe more exciting work that might connect to some of what you're doing through civil society organizations or nonprofits or others that are working directly with the UN on the ground to drive projects and change. So I think also thinking about like the diverse ecosystem of ways that if this is what you're passionate about, and I hope you continue to want to keep working on, to think about different ways that you can engage on those topics and be in sort of the broader UN sphere without only needing to see one specific entry point to that type of engagement.
Thank you for answering. The next question says, around the world, youth disengagement from governance is becoming a serious concern. In contexts like Nepal, where many young people feel excluded from national decision making, how is the UN Youth Office helping to close the gap and inspire renewed youth confidence in public institutions?
Yes, a very timely and topical question. And definitely something that has been, I mean, for a long time, but also especially recently, very much at the forefront of our radar and trying to think through how we can help in or to bridge this sort of gap in those types of contexts. Um, I don't have a perfect answer for this yet, just to say that this is something that our office is very much trying to unpack where we can add value within the UN system. We've been engaging directly with the heads of the UN country teams in a number of countries where we've seen this sort of disconnect in recent months, trying to better understand their experiences, but also what role the UN can more consistently play in cases like this, where they can serve as a bridge of ensuring that young people are more meaningfully included in different governmental decision-making processes. And I think the number one thing we've really been advocating for on this front, and not to oversimplify, because of course every national context is different and has its own intricacies, but I think if we were to speak at a global level, I think this partly reflects the fact that young people, by and large, globally, don't necessarily feel represented or meaningfully engaged in policy and decision-making processes at the moment. And this is where we see a disconnect between young people and institutions. And so, really, if anything, this also underlines the importance of so much of what we're trying to advocate for when it comes to meaningfully engaging young people from the very start, because when young people are more meaningfully engaged, they also feel more represented, more like the decisions that are taken reflect their interests, their priorities, their beliefs. And so really trying to use these as important examples of why it's more important than ever that young people need to be meaningfully at the tables where decisions are made, as one way of addressing some of these challenges. But yes, very much, I would say, front of mind for us in terms of thinking about how we can try to, from a global perspective, connect some of these dots to drive meaningful progress in this area.
Thank you so much. I think it's a really important topic. So thank you for answering this. And we are going to have our last question from Bernard. I see your hand raised up. So can you introduce yourself and then ask your question, please?
Thank you, Liliana. So am I audible? Okay, thank you, Matthew, for the good presentation. So my name is Bernard from Kenya. I actually had two questions. So the first question is, lately we have seen rise in protests from youths, mostly in Africa. So, and we have seen the government retaliating in an extent of killing, using live bullets to kill the youth. So my question was, as much as we have a humanitarian group who try and remedy the situation, is the United Nations Youth Office also participating in maybe assisting youths in this specific scenario? Then my second question is, I've been trying to apply to the UNB. Mostly I've been trying to apply on the online volunteering because I'm quite engaged physically. So I've been applying, then I'm not getting any response. So I don't know, is the system set that way, or maybe my portal has an issue? Like, okay, there was one time I applied for one physically, and I got a response on the email, like they have seen my application, but that was physical. But online, I've not been getting responses. So I'm not sure, like, if maybe you have an answer, maybe you can elaborate well on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, on the first one, just to say again, this is, I would say, very much top of mind, and I think very of most critical importance. There was actually a similar, of course, it's not like a one-off thing, and this has been a trend we've seen for a long time, around like increasing violence and shrinking civic space when it comes to young people, not just young people, but young people in particular, and their ability to exercise freedom of expression. Um, we so there's I guess there's two things here. One is that we've tried to be very strong in public advocacy on this around protecting young people's freedom of expression, and underlining that as a fundamental human right. And this is, you see it also from the UN Secretary General at the highest level in each of these instances, both recently but also historically, when there's cases where young people are disproportionately facing violence or a range of other things in relation to exercising that right. But what I would also encourage you, there is a specific mechanism within the UN. So there's an independent expert in the UN who works specifically on protecting freedom of expression and opinion. And there's other independent experts that work on other related topics as it relates to human rights violations and other things on this topic. And through this, there is a formal mechanism through which anyone, including young people and others, can and should report when they face instances of this, and it triggers a sort of formal UN process to uh, to address it. I won't sit here and say necessarily, I'm also not an expert necessarily in those processes specifically. I won't say that they're perfect or imperfect, but I think it's really important in cases like this, in addition to being very vocal around advocating that that's not okay and that we need to respect fundamental human rights across the board, that it's also really important to recognize the formal processes that are put in place by the UN and others, and to see those hopefully as channels and resources that can help to prevent this from happening again in future. And I think, yeah, advocating, especially in light of shrinking civic space, this is more important than ever. On the second question around UN volunteers, this is actually a great suggestion, maybe to the earlier question as well. I think UN volunteers is a great avenue for young people who are also looking to engage with the UN. So for others who might not have looked into this yet, I would look into it. Despite the name, they're not necessarily all voluntary. That most of the positions they're paid, and there are different opportunities to engage around the world. So it's a great way to look at different opportunities within the UN as a young professional. I'm sorry to hear about that it hasn't necessarily been the most straightforward experience from your end. In principle, it shouldn't make a difference, I think, whether it's online, in person, through which channel. I think part of the challenge might be that, as you can imagine, a lot of UN postings get huge volumes of interest and other things like this. And also it's not the most ideal time, as I'm sure you've seen, because the UN is also undergoing like sort of a global restructuring and trying to like relook at how the institution can be reshaped for the 21st century, which I think is a good exercise. But as a result of it, there's also a lot of current UN staff that are losing their jobs or other things around the world as the organization downsizes. So it's a bit of a tricky time in terms of the UN itself. But I would encourage you to definitely continue applying to those channels. And to also, maybe one thing to underline would be to really look, whether it's through UN volunteers or anywhere else, look for the parts of the UN system that are niche and a good fit to the expertise and experience that you have. I think so often people just see UN and they think that all UN is the same, but it's a super diverse global organization. And so I guarantee that there's a part of the UN, whether that's through UN volunteers or somewhere else, that's working on the specific thing that you're working on. And so to look for those types of opportunities and positions, and I think they'll really strengthen your ability to sell yourself as a someone who can contribute. I hope that's helpful.
Well, thank you so much for everyone who shared their questions. And also a huge thank you, Matthew, for your time and insights today. So for those who would like to stay connected with you, could you please share your preferred contact in the chat? So before we wrap up, I would like to remind everyone about our upcoming Saturday networking and upskilling hour this Saturday, November 1st at 9 a.m. East time. We will discuss about local challenge, global perspectives. The session will delve into the importance of building partnerships that are representative of local challenge and work towards community-driven solutions that also offers a global perspective. More information already on your email, so check your email. We have an upcoming Millennium Fellowship webinar, just like this one. It's going to be Soya Mayari, a Palestinian-Ukrainian peace ambassador, storyteller, and founder of Waves to Home. It's going to be on Monday, November 3rd, 10 a.m. East Time. And also, we have Julia Furnari, Executive Director of the Coach Foundation and the Tapestry Foundation, this Tuesday, November 4th, 4th, 12 p.m. East Time. And last one, we're going to have Sumaya Barak this Friday, November 7th at 9 a.m. East Time. So thank you to everyone who has been here today. And thank you, Matthew, last time. It's really glad to hear you. I like all of your answers. I really love it. I didn't know more about the UN Youth Office, but now I know more than yesterday. And I'm really glad I have this information from today. So thank you.
Thank you all so much.